I stood on my own porch with a hospital bag in one hand and my house key in the other, and it wouldn't turn. I tried again, slower this time, thinking maybe my hands were still weak, but the lock didn't even catch. It was new. My name was still on the mailbox. My car was still in the driveway. Everything I owned was inside that house, and I was standing outside like I didn't belong there anymore. I didn't knock, not yet, because in that moment, I already knew this wasn't an accident. I'm 74 years old. I spent 40 years working for the city of Indianapolis, fixing water mains and managing crews in the freezing rain so I could own a piece of dirt and a roof that stayed dry. My wife, Martha, died 4 years ago, and since then, the house had been quiet. Maybe too quiet. That's why I didn't hesitate when my daughter Sarah suggested she and her husband Greg move in to help out. I thought it was a blessing. I thought it meant I wouldn't have to face the shadows alone. The surgery was supposed to be routine, just a hip replacement. I was only gone for 6 days. 6 days is all it took for the world I built to be bolted shut against me. I finally reached out and pressed the doorbell. I heard the chimes inside, the ones Martha picked out because they sounded like a cathedral. I waited. The sun was starting to dip behind the oaks in the front yard, casting long, jagged shadows across the porch. When the door finally opened, it wasn't Sarah. It was Greg. He was wearing my old flannel shirt, the one I usually kept on a hook by the back door. He didn't open the door all the way. He just stood there in the gap, looking at me like I was a salesman he was about to turn away. There was no, "Welcome home." There was no, "How are you feeling?" There was just a heavy, suffocating silence. "The key doesn't work, Greg," I said. My voice sounded thinner than I wanted it to. Greg cleared his throat and looked past me at the street. "Yeah, well, we had a bit of a security scare while you were at St. Vincent's. Someone tried the back door. I had to swap the cylinders out for something more heavy-duty. For Sarah's sake, you know?" He didn't move. He didn't step back to let me in. He just kept his hand on the frame, blocking the entrance to my own life. Behind him, I could hear the television. It was loud, a game show I never watched. My house used to smell like cedar and coffee. Now, it smelled like something sharp and chemical, like industrial cleaner. "I'd like to sit down, Greg," I said, shifting my weight onto my good leg. The ache in my hip was starting to flare, a dull, pulsing heat that made my vision blur. "It's been a long drive." He hesitated for a second, then finally stepped aside, but he didn't take my bag. As I limped past him into the foyer, I realized the rug was gone. The antique Persian runner Martha had saved for 3 years to buy was replaced by a cheap, gray mat. I looked toward the living room and stopped dead. My recliner, the one that fit the curve of my back perfectly, was gone. In its place stood a sleek, white sectional sofa that looked like it belonged in a hotel lobby. "Where's my chair, Greg?" I asked. Sarah walked out of the kitchen then, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She didn't look happy to see me. She looked exhausted, or maybe annoyed. She didn't come over to hug me. She just stayed by the breakfast bar. "It was falling apart, Dad," she said, her voice clipped. "We moved some things around to make more room. We need to talk about the living arrangements now that you're back. Things have changed." I took a breath, trying to steady myself as the throbbing in my hip shifted from a dull ache to a sharp, rhythmic pulse. I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to tell me she was joking, but her eyes were flat, professional, like she was delivering a quarterly report instead of breaking her father's heart. She didn't offer me a chair. She just stood there by the granite island we'd installed 10 years ago, tapping her polished fingernails against the surface. "What things, Sarah?" I managed to ask. "I was gone for 6 days, not 6 years." "Dad, be reasonable," she said, her voice dropping into that condescending tone people use for toddlers or the dying. "You can't navigate the stairs anymore. It's a liability for us. We've moved your bedroom to the basement. It's more of a garden suite now. It's quieter. The basement in this house isn't a suite. It's a concrete box where I keep my Christmas lights and my old circular saw. It's damp, and the only window is a sliver of glass near the ceiling that looks out at the underside of the porch. Greg stepped into the kitchen then, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't look at me. He walked straight to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of expensive water I didn't recognize. "We had to clear out the upstairs for Sarah's office, Robert. And the guest room is going to be a nursery soon. We're thinking ahead." "A nursery?" I felt the air leave my lungs. "You didn't say anything about a baby." "We're planning, Dad," Sarah snapped, her patience clearly thinning. "The point is, we need the square footage. We're the ones keeping this place up. We're the ones paying the property taxes and the homeowner's insurance while you're on a fixed income. It's only fair that we decide how the space is used." I looked around the kitchen. My spice rack was gone. The hand-painted ceramic clock Martha brought back from a trip to Charleston had been replaced by a digital screen showing the weather and their social calendar. My house felt like a staged home for a real estate listing, and I was just a piece of old furniture that didn't fit the aesthetic. "I'm tired," I said, my voice cracking. "I just want to go to my room, my real room. I need my pills." Greg finally looked at me, but there was no pity in his eyes. Only a cold, hard calculation. "I'll bring your bag down to the basement in a minute. But don't go looking for your old keys, Robert. I changed the interior locks too. For safety." He patted his pocket, and I heard the unmistakable jingle of a heavy brass ring. I realized then that I wasn't just a guest in my own home. I was a prisoner who had just been handed his new cell. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, a damp chill that seemed to seep straight into my new hip. I spent the first 48 hours down there, staring at the gray concrete walls and the exposed insulation hanging from the ceiling like cobwebs. My bed was a twin mattress I'd bought for Sarah when she was 10, pushed into a corner near the humming water heater. Every time I needed a glass of water or the bathroom, I had to face those 12 wooden steps. They felt like a mountain. Each stair was a fresh bolt of white-hot pain, and Sarah would just stand in the kitchen, watching me struggle with a look of practiced pity that didn't reach her eyes. By Thursday, the isolation was starting to grate on me. I shuffled up the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps, only to find Greg sitting at my cherry wood dining table. He had my private files spread out like he was auditing a failing business. My birth certificate, my bank statements, even the deed to the house, things I kept locked in a firebox in my closet, were laid bare under the light of the chandelier Martha had picked out 30 years ago. "You're up," Greg said, not looking at me. He was circling numbers on my city pension statement with a red pen. "We were looking at your silver account. You've got a significant amount of liquidity just sitting there, Robert. It's not doing anyone any good." "That's my medicine money, Greg," I said, leaning hard on my cane. "And that's my mail." "You had no right to open it." Sarah walked in from the hallway, carrying a stack of legal folders. She didn't look like my daughter anymore. She looked like an adversary. "We have every right, Dad. We're the ones managing this property now. We've been talking to a specialist about your future. With the way you've been acting, forgetful, leaving the side door unlocked, we think it's time to move toward a more formal arrangement." "I haven't forgotten a thing," I snapped, though my voice lacked the steel I wanted. "That's not what the notes say," she replied coolly, sliding a document across the table toward me. It was a durable power of attorney form, along with a quitclaim deed for the house. "If you sign these over to us, we can shield your assets from the state. Otherwise, if you have another fall, the nursing home will take everything. We're just trying to protect you." I looked at the signature lines, then back at them. Greg was watching me, his jaws set, waiting for me to break. I realized then that they weren't worried about my health. They were worried about the inheritance. I reached for the papers, my hand trembling, but it wasn't from age. It was from a cold, hard realization of what they were actually capable of doing to me. "I need to think," I whispered, turning back toward the basement door. As I pulled the handle, I felt a resistance I hadn't noticed before. I looked up and saw a new, Heavy-duty sliding bolt had been installed on the outside of the door, glinting under the hallway light. Greg didn't even look up from his red pen as he spoke. "Take all the time you need, Robert. We already told the neighbors you're staying in the hospital for a few more weeks for observation." I spent the next 2 days in that basement, the hum of the water heater my only company, while the world above me grew distant and cold. My new hip throbbed with a rhythmic, stabbing heat, but I refused to call out for help. I knew by now that Sarah only answered with a sigh of irritation, as if my recovery were a personal insult to her schedule. I kept my clothes in 3 plastic bins stacked against the concrete wall, living like a squatter in the house I had finished paying off a decade ago. Every time the floorboards creaked overhead, I wondered what else of mine was being packed away, sold, or simply tossed into the garbage to make room for their new office. On Saturday morning, I managed to pull myself up the stairs, my knuckles white as I gripped the railing for dear life. I found Sarah in the kitchen, sipping coffee and staring at a glossy brochure for a place called Meadowbrook Gardens. She didn't look up when I entered, but she slid the paper across the granite counter until it rested right in front of my trembling hands. The photos showed elderly people with vacant smiles, sitting in sterile community rooms, a far cry from the life I had built within these walls. "We've already talked to the admissions director, Dad," she said, her voice as sharp and cold as a winter morning in Indianapolis. "They have a spot opening up Tuesday. It's for the best. You're clearly struggling with the stairs, and the debt collectors from your city pension issues are going to start calling soon." I stared at her, my mind racing through the lies they were spinning. There were no debt collectors. My pension was solid, and my savings were untouched. They were manufacturing a crisis to justify disposing of me. I looked past her and saw Greg in the hallway, carrying a heavy cardboard box labeled Attic Keep. Inside, I caught a glimpse of Martha's old sewing kit and the framed photo of my father's unit from the war. "That's not your property, Greg," I said, my voice finally finding a bit of its old gravel. He stopped and looked at me, a smirk playing on his lips that made my blood run cold. "Technically, Robert, everything in this house is part of the estate we're managing. You should be resting. You've got a big move coming up, and we wouldn't want you to have another episode." I turned back to the basement, but I didn't go down the stairs. I waited until I heard the garage door slam and the sound of Greg's car fading down the street. I knew I only had a few hours before the locks became my permanent reality. I reached into the back of the hallway closet, behind the heavy winter coats, and felt for the small, loose floorboard I'd installed 30 years ago. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of my spare burner phone and the business card of an old friend who specialized in estate law. I realized then that they thought I was a broken old man because I'd let them think it. But as I dialed the number, watching the shadows of my own children move across the kitchen window, I knew the one thing they had forgotten. I was the one who designed the foundation of this family, and I knew exactly where the cracks were. I waited until the house was silent, the only sound the distant hum of the central air that I had paid to install 5 years ago. My hands were shaking, but not from the surgery or the cold basement air. I pulled the burner phone from the floorboard, my thumb hovering over the dial button for my old friend, Arthur. He'd handled the city's legal contracts for decades, and he knew exactly what this house meant to me. As the line rang, I looked up at the basement ceiling, hearing the muffled footsteps of Greg pacing in the kitchen directly above my head. "Arthur," I whispered when he picked up, "they're moving me to Meadowbrook on Tuesday. They've already opened my files. They're trying to take the deed." There was a long silence on the other end, the kind of silence that tells you a professional is already calculating the damage. "Robert," Arthur said, his voice grave, "if they've got the power of attorney and the quitclaim ready, they aren't just waiting for you to sign. They're likely already using a temporary guardianship filing to freeze your access." I felt a cold sweat break across my neck. I wasn't just being pushed out. I was being erased legally before I could even fight back. I told him about the new locks and the way Sarah looked at me, like I was a ghost haunting her new life. "Listen to me," Arthur continued. Don't sign a single scrap of paper. I'm sending a courier to the house tomorrow with a formal revocation of any implied consent. But Robert, there's something else you need to know. I did a quick search on the property title while we were talking. There's a lien request sitting in the county queue. Greg put a signature on a bridge loan application using this house as collateral 3 days ago. The room seemed to tilt. My son-in-law hadn't just moved my furniture. He had mortgaged my life to fund a lifestyle I never approved of. They didn't want me in a nursing home for my health. They needed me out of the way so the bank wouldn't ask questions about the sole occupant of the property. I realized then that the security scare Greg mentioned wasn't about a burglar. It was about keeping me from seeing the foreclosure warnings that had started arriving while I was under the knife. I hung up the phone and tucked it back into the dark corner of the joists. I didn't go back to sleep. I sat on that thin mattress and waited for the sun to rise, watching the sliver of light hit the concrete floor. When Sarah opened the basement door at 7 in the morning to bring me a cold piece of toast, she didn't realize I was looking at her with entirely new eyes. I wasn't her father anymore. I was the only thing standing between her husband and a prison cell for mortgage fraud. Ready for your tour today, Dad? She asked, her voice light and false. I didn't answer. I just reached into my pocket and felt the small brass key I'd hidden, the one to the old desk in the attic they hadn't found yet. I waited until Greg left for the hardware store, his truck rumbling down the driveway of the house I had spent 40 years maintaining. Sarah was in the backyard, her back turned as she talked loudly on her cell phone about fabric swatches for her new office. I didn't use my cane. I crawled. I dragged my recovering hip up those 12 basement stairs, inch by agonizing inch, until I reached the main floor. The pain was a white-hot iron, but the cold realization of Arthur's words kept me moving. I reached the attic pull-down in the hallway, the one Greg had ignored because he thought it only held old holiday tinsel. Inside my father's roll-top desk, tucked behind a false backing he'd built after the war, was the original deed and the true power of attorney I'd granted to Martha, which explicitly barred any secondary transfers without a notarized mental competency hearing. I tucked the yellowed parchment into my robe just as I heard the kitchen door creak open. Sarah was standing there, her face contorting from surprise to a sharp, jagged fury. "What are you doing up here, Dad?" she hissed, her voice dropping the facade of the grieving daughter. "You're supposed to be resting for Meadowbrook." I didn't flinch. I held the railing of the stairs, my knuckles white, and looked her straight in the eye. "I know about the bridge loan, Sarah. I know Greg forged my name on a lien request while I was at St. Vincent's." Her face went from red to a ghostly, translucent white. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try. She just stepped closer, her shadow falling over me like a shroud. "We were drowning, Dad. Greg's firm collapsed 6 months ago. We didn't have a choice. This house is just sitting here, and you don't need all this space." I realized then that I wasn't her father anymore. I was just a line of credit she was trying to liquidate. "It's fraud, Sarah," I whispered. She laughed, a short, brittle sound that echoed in the empty hallway. "Who's going to believe a 74-year-old man who can't even find the bathroom? We've already started the paperwork for the emergency guardianship. By Tuesday, your word won't mean a thing in a court of law." She reached for the papers in my hand, her fingers clawing at the pocket of my robe, but I pulled back, the adrenaline masking the scream of my nerves. I made it back to the basement door and slid the bolt home from the inside, a trick I'd rigged years ago for when the grandkids were small. I sat on that twin mattress, the original deed clutched to my chest, and listened to her screaming and pounding on the wood. She didn't know that Arthur was already standing in the clerk's office downtown, or that the man I'd called on the burner phone wasn't just a lawyer. He was the county prosecutor I'd played cards with for 30 years. I sat in the dark of that concrete room for 3 hours, the original deed clutched to my chest, listening as the silence of the house changed from a peaceful hum to a jagged, desperate quiet. Sarah had stopped screaming at the door, but I could hear her whispering in the kitchen, the frantic, hushed tones of someone watching their world catch fire. I used the burner phone one last time to tell Arthur that the front gate was unlocked, and then I waited in the shadows. At 10 o'clock, the blue and red lights of a patrol car cut through the small basement window, sweeping across the cold floor like a searchlight. I didn't go up the stairs until I heard the heavy, rhythmic knock of the county sheriff on the front door. When I finally slid the bolt back and stepped into the hallway, Greg was standing by the foyer, his face a mask of disbelief as the officers moved in. Sarah was sitting on that new, white sectional sofa, her head in her hands. She looked up at me, her eyes red and pleading, but I didn't see my daughter anymore. I saw a stranger who had tried to lock me in a cellar to steal the equity from my bones. "Dad, please," she whispered, her voice cracking as she reached out a hand. "We can fix this. It was just a mistake. If you tell them you signed it, it all goes away." I looked at her, then at the paperwork for the Meadowbrook nursing home still sitting on the counter. I realized then that a home isn't about the bricks or the deed. It's about who you can trust when the lights go out. I handed the original, unspent power of attorney to the officer and walked toward the door, my hips screaming with every step. "Where are you going?" Greg shouted, his voice echoing through the house I had spent 40 years maintaining. "You can't just leave us like this?" I didn't answer. I stepped out onto the porch into the cool night air of Indianapolis. As I reached the end of the driveway, I saw another car pull up, a black sedan I didn't recognize. A man I'd never seen before stepped out, clutching a briefcase and looking at my house with a proprietary glint in his eyes. He looked at me, then at the police lights, and checked his watch. I realized then that the bridge loan wasn't the only shadow hanging over this roof. I stood on the sidewalk, my hospital bag at my feet, watching the stranger approach my front door while the sirens grew louder in the distance. I wonder now, as the wind picks up, just how many people have a key to my life that I never gave them. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There's more to come.